looked at his a'mal and said, these a'mal are to be my companions now and there's nothing here. They turn back. Now that they've seen reality, they've seen what happens and what they did with their affairs, they say, oh Allah, send me back to life. قال ربي ارجعوني. Send me back to life. Why? Why do you want to be alive again? لعلي أعمل صالحا فيما تركت. That I can do good deeds with those things that I left behind. Whether that's the wealth that they left behind and the dunya that they collected, whether that's their children, whatever that is that they left behind, they say, oh Allah, those were my resources. I was supposed to be using them to improve my soul and my condition so that when I came here I had something with me. But I didn't do it. Send me back. And I promise, if you send me back, I'll do good things. I'll be a good person. I'll do all of those acts of ibadah. But look at what Allah says. He says, Kalla. Certainly no. Now this Kalla that Allah says could mean one of two things. That's one, no, we will never send you back. It'll never happen. You can't go back. The other interpretation of this Kalla is that you say you want to go back and you'll do good, but you won't do good. Kalla, you won't do good. You're just saying that. And which is why Allah continues, Kalla. Innaha قائلها إنها قالوا إنها كلام هي قائلها. So Allah says that no, you won't actually do it. Certainly these are just words that you are saying. You don't actually mean them. One of the questions we had with the youth yesterday in our discussion was that isn't it unfair that Allah, for example, if He takes the life away from someone, what if they were going to do good after that? What if they were going to be a good person after that? Here Allah is proving, He says, when I take away the soul, when I remove the soul from the body, that person is going to remain on that track consistently. He may say that he would have done differently, but Allah says, I gave him plenty of time to change. And when his character was firm and no longer changing anymore, and that there was no chance of him changing, then I took away his soul. Which is why Allah says, Kalla, innaha qailuha, innaha, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. إنها كلمة هو قائلها. That these are just words that he is saying. He doesn't mean anything of it. If he would have continued his life, he would have continued on this path. We have some narrations that discuss with us, for example, where our Holy Prophet, he taught us, he says that man has the freedom to bring change into his character and behavior until the age of 40. Once he reaches the age of 40, whoever he is at that time, he will remain that personality for the rest of his life. That he will continue down the same path without change once he reaches this age. Now, whether this is halat al-am, that a general statement being made that most people are of this consideration, or if all people are of this consideration, our belief is that Allah has the ability to offer us hidayah at any point in time. And we should continue to search for that hidayah, but be conscientious that I am constantly striving on improving my character and behavior throughout my life. So we see that this man, now that he's dead, he turns to his deeds, he looks for assistance and he can't find it. He is in a state of fear and confusion as he is being brought to his grave. This is why our sixth Imam said, he says, when you take someone to their grave, don't take them with haste. This is a new change that has happened for this person, this new separation of their soul and body, and they are anxious and nervous and afraid of this experience, which is why Imam says, take them and then put them down and give them a pause. And then take them again and then give them a pause, and then take them to the grave before you bury them. This is why many times when we go to the graveyard to bury someone, we stop 3 times along the process, so that the body begins the process of acclimation to the fear and the experience that it's in. When we get to the grave, it's many recommendations are there. One of the differences of the various madahib actually that we don't talk about is the difference of how someone is buried. In madhab Jaffari, when we bury someone with their right shoulder facing to Qibla. That we turn the body in such a way that their right shoulder faces to Qibla, and that we lie them on their side facing Qibla. Amongst the various other madahib, the tradition is that you bury someone with their feet facing Qibla. That you bury them so that their feet are facing towards Qibla and their head is in the opposite direction of Qibla. One of the things that we should pay attention to is that when we bury someone, we ensure that we give them their huquq. Our Maraja have taught us that the burial and the rite of the burial and the ahkam of the burial should be performed according to the madhab that the person followed. So for example, though it may be part of our madhab to bury with the right shoulder facing in this direction, if for example sometimes there are families that are mixed, some members of the family are of Ahl Sunnah and some are of Shia, or they have different schools of thought, whatever the madhab of that person is, bury them according to their madhab. And this sometimes, for example, in the case of families where there are blended families, we have this problem sometimes. There was a situation a few years ago, we went to go bury someone, it was a woman who was madhab Jaffari, her husband was not. And her siblings who came for the burial, they insisted that the grave be laid out facing Qibla. And the husband said, no, we don't bury that way. And he said the insistence should be this way. And an argument broke out between the two about how this person should be buried. And they said, according to her madhab and her practice, it's this is the appropriate way. And he said, I am the wali and I am the in charge, and this is the way we will bury them. And in the end, since she had made no wasi or declaration, or this wasn't a matter that they had prepared for, or even thought about death, she was buried with her feet facing Qibla. So our responsibility is, again, as we mentioned in wasi and of these matters, if we know that these affairs, and we know, inna maut al-haq, that death is haq, it's truth. Allah has guaranteed it. We should ensure that we prepare our affairs and take these into consideration when we make decisions in life, so that we are ready for these affairs. That moment that a body enters into the grave is a very difficult time for that body, and there are a lot of difficulties that befall that body. One of the things that we discussed that happens is the initial squeezing of the grave, or what's called fishar-e qabr. Fishar-e qabr is the squeezing of the grave that happens on the body when a person is deceased and they are buried. There are a number of narrations that talk about a'mal that we can perform to protect ourselves from the squeezing of the grave, including the recitation of Quran, including various ad'iyah, for example, on the night of the 7th of Rajab, again, the a'mal that are recommended, or on the night of Laylatul Mab'ath. There are a'mal that talk about that if we perform these a'mal, Allah will protect you from the squeezing of the grave. One of the things we can do for the deceased, our Holy Prophet taught us, is to include jaridatain, or two branches within the sides of the kafan. And as long as those branches remain wet, that the body will not be squeezed. So what happens is that the initial description is from a particular tree, and they say that no, it has to be from this one type of tree. But what we found in hadith is that it can be any type of tree. Now what happens is sometimes what they do is they go and they take thin little branches and they try to put it in, and those thin little branches, how quickly does a thin branch dry? Very quickly. It has no moisture in it itself. The recommendation is you get a thick branch and you split it in half and include it on either side of the kafan to bury with them, and that is a source of protection for that body. As long as those branches remain wet, the body will not be squeezed. That first night in the grave is the most difficult night. Our Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that the first night in the grave is the most difficult night on a mu'min. So in that time, he said, the best thing that you can do for the deceased in that moment when they enter their grave for the first night is to give sadaqah on their behalf to remove the difficulties of the grave. So the people then, what they did was they complained. Remember, Rasulullah is teaching this in the time of the establishment of the religion of Islam. Most of the first mu'mineen who joined Islam were poor. They didn't have food for themselves. They were in a state of extreme poverty. They said, Ya Rasulullah, this man has died, we want to assist him, but we don't have money for food for ourselves. How shall we give sadaqah on his behalf? So they asked the question, Ya Rasulullah, if we don't have money for sadaqah, what can we do for the deceased? So Rasulullah said, if you don't have the ability to give sadaqah, recite Salat Wahshat Qabr. Salat Wahshat Qabr is a 2 rakat salat that's mustahab to recite when someone passes away. And this 2 rakat salat assists and removes the difficulties of the grave at that point in time. And when we talk about this 2 rakat salat, it's very straightforward. In the first rakat, you recite Surah Al-Fatiha and Ayat Al-Kursi. In the second rakat, Surah Fatiha 10 times, Surah Al-Qadr. And at the end, you say, oh Allah, give the thawab of this salat to marhum so-and-so. Amongst our ulama and some of the pious people in the world, we've seen narrations that talk about that there are those on this earth who perform this every night for the mu'mineen, wherever they may be, that have passed away in this world. And the truth of its benefit, people have seen when they see their relatives sometimes in a dream and they say, you seem to be in a good condition. They say that Fulan bin Fulan, he recited this salat for me and it was an assistance for me in my state of difficulty. Now, when we talk about the state of the qabr, upon entrance of the qabr, one of the things that we have yaqeen that happens is that Allah sends two angels to perform the questioning of the grave. And we know that these two angels come, Munkar and Nakir, and they question that person. Now, as we mentioned, this is a state of difficulty. It's a new foreign place that this man has come to. It's something completely different, and we say that he is in a state of difficulty and he doesn't know. He's astounded by his surroundings. The same way we have it in our own lives. If all of a sudden someone picked you up and took you from your home and dropped you into a foreign land, you would say, where did I come? What happened to me? In the same way as this soul, that it all of a sudden shows up in a different land and it's in a state of difficulty. So it's recommended that for this person, when they pass away, we recite for them talqeen. This talqeen is the reminder of aqeedah. And it's the reminder of who you are and what your faith is, because the questioning of Munkar and Nakir is pertaining to your faith. Now, for a pause for a second, because again, the idea, our goal in this conversation is when we take a look at these riwayat and these narrations and these descriptions of akhirah, we haven't seen it. But we want to make it an image in our minds so that we remember these affairs and we keep them alive in our day-to-day life, and we use them as a guidance for us to understand how do we prepare for our akhirah. When we look at, for example, the questioning of the grave and the questioning of the Day of Judgment, there's a difference that we notice. That in the grave, the questioning is about your aqeedah. Man rabbak, ma kitabuk, man imamuk, man nabiyuk, who is your Allah, who is your kitab, what is your kitab, what is your religion, who is your prophet, who is your imam. And when we look at the description of Yawm al-Qiyamah, we take a look and we see that, and we'll discuss this, that Yawm al-Qiyamah is associated with answering for your deeds. That it talks about that the first station, our Imam taught us, the first station on the Day of Judgment that you will have to pass will be questioning about your prayers. In qubilat, qubilat ma siwa, wa in ruddat, ruddat ma siwa. That the Day of Judgment, the first thing that you will have to answer about is your prayers. If your salat is accepted, everything after your salat will be accepted. And if your salat is not accepted, nothing after your salat will be accepted from you. So the description of the Day of Judgment talks about a'mal and talking about the affairs and how you dealt with people. The first station on the Day of Judgment is not who is your Lord. That's in the grave. If we look at the questioning of Munkar and Nakir, the first question about your life and the first question that comes to the grave is that will categorize you of where you will rise up on the Day of Judgment. Aqeedah is something that we use to determine, that the malaika will use to determine in the grave in this questioning, to determine which line will you line up in on the Day of Judgment. That when Allah describes that people will be lined up in rows after rows after rows, that the description of these rows, how does you know which row you're going to go in? The determination of those rows is made in this questioning of Munkar and Nakir. At the same way, for example, we look at an office building, right? New file comes into an office, new papers come into an office building. Before they decide what needs to be done to these papers, they decide where does this paper belong? Where does this information belong? And they separate it, and they sort it, and they put it in the correct area. The same way, when the soul leaves this earth, the first thing that happens is, the questioning that comes is, where should we place you? Where will you line up on the Day of Judgment? What category do you belong to? Are you amongst the mu'mineen? Are you amongst the Muslimin? Are you amongst the Ahl al-Kitab? Are you amongst the Kuffar? These questions that are raised for us at that moment are associated with our aqeedah, which is why what we say is that for that deceased, maybe you lived your life as a mu'min and a Muslim, but maybe you didn't spend your time and you weren't as firm in your faith, and because of the change in your situation, you become frightened. So we say, don't be scared of this situation. Let us assist you and offer you assistance by reminding you of the question and answer of that which will be asked for you in your grave. Now what's interesting is when we recite talqeen for marhum, what language do we recite it in? Arabic. And if marhum didn't speak Arabic before, Ya Allah, okay, no problem, no help for him then? Doesn't assist him anymore? You know, imagine marhum only spoke, for example, Urdu all his life, passes away, and all of a sudden we're doing talqeen in Arabic. He would say, Baba, are you trying to help me or hurt me? What's going on? The reality is the same way we talked about the powers of the Spirit are hampered by this body, the same comes with the ability of understanding language. The ruh has the ability to understand every language, but the body is what hampers it, which is why when we speak to the deceased, we speak to them in Arabic, and the deceased understands and receives the benefit of the Arabic, even if they never spoke a word of Arabic in their life. You know, like they say, for example, this couple, they went for Hajj from the villages, and when they came back from Hajj, they asked them, how was your Hajj? He said, it was amazing. They said, wherever we went, whoever spoke to us, all they ever did was recite Quran to us. Because they couldn't understand Arabic, the person is yelling at them, you're doing the wrong thing, but they say, MashaAllah, he only speaks in Quran with me. Because they don't know the language. But the truth of the soul is that the soul understands these languages and it benefits. And the malaika are impacted by this talqeen. We have narrations that explain to us that say that, our Aimma say that when a soul is given its talqeen, Munkar and Nakir, when they witness the talqeen, they say there is no point in questioning him, he's already been prepared, leave him alone. That this talqeen has a very practical benefit for that person, that when we prepare him, the malaika say there's no point in questioning, he's been prepared, he knows the answers, leave him alone and give him the path that he will be on for the rest of his life. And in this way, the process of what happens to the soul in the grave begins, and that period of barzakh begins. Now barzakh, as in the verses we were discussing, كَلَّا إِنَّهَا كَلِمَةٌ هُوَ قَائِلُهَا, and then it discusses about barzakh. وَمِن وَرَائِهِمْ بَرْزَخٌ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. That Allah describes, He says that that person will say, send me back so that I may do good. And Allah says He's not going to do good, even if I sent him back. كَلَّا إِنَّهَا كَلِمَةٌ هُوَ قَائِلُهَا. These are just words that He says. Now He says, وَبَيْنَهُمَا بَرْزَخٌ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. That now begins this process of barzakh. And this period of barzakh will remain on this person until they are called back and raised back to life. The literal term of barzakh means a barrier. When we take a look, for example, and we read in Surah Rahman, بَيْنَهُمَا بَرْزَخٌ لَا يَبْغِيَانِ, that when Allah talks about the two seas that meet together, and He says, between them I have placed a barzakh, that they can't pass. The term barzakh literally means barrier. And when we talk about the concept of barzakh, when it refers to the human soul, we're talking about that period of separation between where the human body and soul are attached in this world, and that second period where the human body and the soul will be raised again for questioning and answer. That in this phase, the two have been separated and they are waiting for that time period. Now, the term barzakh itself gives us an indication that it's a barrier between this world and the next. When we take a look and we see some people, they ask questions at the Day of Judgment, how is it possible that Allah will raise a physical body and a spirit? How is that possible? But the same way that the body and the soul are responsible for every action in this world together, the same way when the reward is given, the justice of Allah is such that the physical body and the spirit need to be rewarded together. So this period of barzakh means that period of separation between these two. When we talk about the concept of barzakh and what happens in barzakh, there are many questions that happen about what actually occurs in this time period, what happens in this time period. When we take a look and we see, and there are, again, this is a brief synopsis of information. There is much information that's available to us on this topic, and that prepares us for what to expect in this topic. One of the things that we see is that this time period of waiting, once your categorization is done of where you will go, then you wait, for example, for the day, يَوْمَ يُبْعَثُونَ, the day that you will be called back, and at that point in time, your reward and punishment will be given to you. This is one interpretation, that, for example, many people, what will happen is once they receive their category, they wait in that time period, and when the time comes, that they will be woken up. We say, how is it possible for someone to sleep so long? But the time process of passage of time changes in that period. The same way we saw in the story of Ashab Kahf, that when Allah describes the people of the cave, He says, and we let them sleep there for many years, for a very long time, and when they woke up, Kam labithtum, how much did you sleep? And they say, Yawm or Yawmain, Yawm or Nusful Yawm, that we slept for a small period, maybe a day. And then when they take their money into the marketplace to buy bread, they find out that we were asleep for maybe 100 years. That time period that passes in there is something that Allah makes brief very quickly. We have descriptions, for example, from even some of the Anbiya of Bani Israel. One of the stories that Muharram Majalis narrates, one of the narrations he narrates, he says that there was a generation of the Bani Israel. And in that time, the ibadat, the worship of the Bani Israel was to travel in the earth and look at the signs of Allah and acknowledge the beauty in the signs of Allah. He says at one point in time, a bunch of youth who were traveling in this earth and performing ibadat by doing the hamd and thana of Allah in this earth, they came upon a grave. When they came upon the grave, they wondered, what was this person's life? What was his experience on this earth like? How did he live his life? So they sat at his grave and they prayed to Allah. They said, oh Allah, give him life so that he can tell us about what his experience was. What was his lifetime like? They say that from their dua, this person raised from their grave and they saw an old man with white hair before them. And they said, we wanted to ask you, what was your life like? What was this like? He says, I was a young man who passed away in my youth, and I was someone who spent my life in worship. They said, but when we see you now coming out of your grave, you have white hair, you look old. He says, I feel as if I just died yesterday. But when Allah brought me back to life, I had such great fear that the day of judgment had come, that from the fear that now that when I woke up, a moment later was the day of judgment, my hair turned white out of fear. That many people in this description of Barzakh will have this time period will be as if a moment in their eyes, they won't even realize it and they'll wake up. But then we have other narrations that talk about those people who will have goodness associated with them and those that will have evil associated with them. Someone came to our sixth Imam, Imam Jaffar ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhi salam, and he said, tell us about what Allah does with the soul of a mu'min. We have heard from some people, they narrate to us that Allah takes the soul of a mu'min, encloses it in the chest of a green-colored bird, and that bird flies around the arsh of Allah until the day of judgment. So Imam Sadiq says, the soul of a mu'min is not something cheap and not something simple that Allah should turn it into a bird. A mu'min is far greater in the eyes of Allah than something that should be turned into a bird. So he said, Ya Rasulullah, then teach us, what happens in this period of barzakh after the soul leaves the body? Imam Sadiq says that there are two general categories that people fall in. There are those who spent their lives in evil, and they made evil sins and they committed sins. For them, Allah has dedicated a place on this earth by the name of Wadi al-Barhut. Wadi al-Barhut, or Valley of Barhut, refers to one of the hottest places on the earth that is present in the country of Yemen. And the Imam says that this wadi is from amongst the wadis, or this valley is from amongst the valleys of hell. And that soul, who is a sinful soul, spends his time receiving punishment of Allah in Wadi al-Barhut, waiting for the day of judgment to come. And that this is how his existence will be in the state of barzakh. And then Imam says, and then there are the mu'mineen. For the mu'mineen, Allah has prepared a wadi called Wadi al-Salam. That is the graveyard that is by the grave of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And he says, this Wadi al-Salam is one of the valleys from the valleys of heaven. And when a mu'min passes away, Allah takes his soul from that place and transports him to this valley of heaven. Now Imam continues, he says, when the mu'min enters into this valley of heaven, he is still in the process of coping with the transition of leaving his body. So when he comes there, the mu'mineen give him some time to adjust to his new surroundings and environment. Once he has adjusted to his environment, the mu'mineen begin to visit him. And they sit and they discuss with him and they ask him about their friends and their relatives and people who they left alive in this world. And sometimes the mu'min tells him, Fulan bin Fulan is alive still. And they say, Inshallah, he'll join us soon. Sometimes they ask about a person and he says, Fulan bin Fulan is deceased. And they become saddened by this news that they say, if he's not here with us, then where must he be? And we take a look and we see that this becomes the process of the reward and the punishment of Allah begins. And then Imam describes that Wadi al-Salam is a place where these mu'mineen gather and they spend their time together in their days, and that this is a place of enjoyment for them. As another riwayah that discusses this, there's a narration that when Amir al-Mu'mineen was traveling on his way to Kufa, he stopped in a place and he sat down on the ground and he relaxed. And as he sat there, one of his companions, Ibn Abbas, came to him and he says, shall I lay down a blanket for you? He says, no, you'll disturb the mu'mineen. Ibn Abbas says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, what do you mean you'll disturb the Amir al-Mu'mineen? He says, oh Ibn Abbas, if you could see what I see, that I am gathered here on this land, and this land was the land of Wadi Salam. He says the mu'mineen have gathered here and they are enjoying each other's company and they were sitting together and having a pleasurable time, and your interference and disturbing them would be a problem for them. So don't bother them and leave them alone. Let me sit and enjoy the pleasure of sitting with the mu'mineen. So in the same way, our desire is that when we die, when we leave this world, that we want to go to Wadi Salam and be included amongst the mu'mineen that are there. Which is why forever, whenever we have the opportunity to go for ziyarah, we go to the ziyarah of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And we hope that he gives us a place in his company, that we get a grave there, or that at least we are invited there and that we are not strangers in this land of peace. There are some questions that people say that if one were to be buried there, then would there be no questioning for him? To the extent where someone asked Imam Rada, they said, if someone was to be buried next to the grave of Abu Abdullah in Karbala, does that mean that there would be no punishment or that no questioning or difficulty for him? Imam Rada, he replied, he says, who has the audacity to disturb one of the guests of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam? And which angel would it be that would be one who has the audacity to question or trouble the guests of Imam al-Hussain? Never imagine that these matters and affairs of, for example, our death or where we are buried are in our hands. Even, for example, in past years where difficulties were in the lands of Iraq and people would be nervous about going to Iraq because they said, what if I am killed there? Shahadat is not an accidental business. To die because of your faith or to be killed because of your faith is not accidental. It's not something that could just happen to anybody. It's a tawfiq from Allah. It's someone who receives immediate entrance into heaven. You think Allah just gives that to anybody? No. To be able to forego the questioning, the difficulty, the challenges of the qabr, to be able to forego the questioning of the Day of Judgment is not a simple affair that anyone can attain. It's something that someone whose heart is pure and clean, that Allah rewards with this action. Our job is not to be afraid of these things. It's rather that it should be an honor that should be bestowed on someone, that all of these affairs are straightened out for them. Sometimes we talk about, for example, there's an explanation that explains that how is it that someone who is buried in Wadi Salam could be given the opportunity to enter into heaven without questioning. They said, look at the characteristics of the hospitality of the Arab. There's a story that they write, when they describe this, they say that an Arab was traveling, he was a Bedouin, he was traveling and he set up his tent. When he set up his tent in the desert, there was a group of locusts, insects, who were flying through and they took shelter on the side of his tent, in the shade of his tent. There were some people from one of the local tribes who were hunting these locusts because it's something that's edible and they wanted to hunt them and collect them. When they came upon the tent of this Arab who was traveling, the Arab heard them from far away. Because it's a desert, sound carries. So he heard them coming. He came out of his tent to see who came. He saw the locusts on the side of his tent and these men who came. And he says, what is your business? They said, we have been hunting these locusts, and as they flew onto your tent, we want to collect them. The Arab said, and this is the nature of the hospitality of the Arab, he said that we, the Arab, have a practice that one who comes into our area is protected. These, even though they are locusts, they're not people. They've come onto the side of my tent. They're in my property. I don't want you to disturb them. When they leave, you can do whatever you want. He said, he must be joking. I mean, who gives rights to locusts? Who gives rights? It's an insect. So they laughed at him and they went to go collect the locusts. And the man came out with his sword and his spear and he sat down. He says, you didn't understand my point. That anything and anyone who takes security within my boundary is one to whom I cannot allow harm to come. And he sat there and he guarded these locusts all night until the next morning when they flew away. The author of the book, he writes, when he discusses the fadail of Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says that if the nature of an Arab and his hospitality is such that he would even protect the locusts who stay on his tent, then how can one imagine that their grave is next to the grave of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and Amir al-Mu'mineen won't be a protector for them from the difficulties of the Day of Judgment. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala This is why our hope and our goal is that may Allah give us a space in the company of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and give us a position with the Ahlul Bayt. These nights we gather to discuss the affairs of Ahlul Bayt and the masa'ib of Ahlul Bayt. And our hope is to continue to build our connection with them so that they may continue to be our wasila in dunya and akhirah. There's a narration of one of the teachers in the city of Qum who used to teach Bahth al-Kharij. One year suddenly he began his lessons, and whenever he began his lessons, all of a sudden he used to just begin Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen and start his lesson. One day it changed, that he began his lesson and he started by reciting the masa'ib of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. And he would begin his lesson and stop for 10 minutes, recite the masa'ib of Imam al-Hussain, and then begin his lesson. Now, a human being, a normal human being, when they do something for a reason, and especially someone who is a teacher of Islam, never does something or tries his best never to do something without a reason. So one day his students, after this continued for a period of time, they sat with him and they said, Sayyidina, you used to begin your lesson and now you've changed where you begin your lesson by mentioning the masa'ib of Abu Abdullah first. What happened? Why did you change this? He says, one night I had a dream. In my dream, it was the Day of Judgment. And Alhamdulillah, by the barakah, we were grouped in the lines of the Ahlul Bayt. And each of the Imams had a line. And everyone who was in that line, the Imam stood at the front of the line and did shifa'ah for the person in that line. I found myself on that day with many of the other ulama and talaba in the line of our sixth Imam, Imam Jaffar ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhi salam. Says, because we are known as Madhab Ja'fari, and Imam Sadiq was the teacher who taught the fiqh of this religion, the ulama were lined up in the line of Imam Sadiq. And each one, as they would come to the front of the line, Imam Sadiq would discuss everything that they taught and all of the laws that they had explained in this world, and Imam Sadiq would have them present to him the dalil of why they taught the way they did, to ensure that they were honest and sincere in their efforts. He says, in this process I found that our line was very slow, that each person had to be questioned about everything that they taught before they would be allowed into heaven, to ensure that they were honest and sincere. So he says, as I was standing in our line waiting to get the shifa'ah of Imam Sadiq, I looked to my right and I saw a line that was moving very, very, very quickly. When I asked the angels whose line this is, they said this was the line of Imam al-Hussain. And Imam al-Hussain was in the front and waving in people to do shifa'ah. So he said, how is it that they are eligible for the shafa'ah of Imam al-Hussain? So the malaika answered that the people who lined up in the line of Imam al-Hussain were those who used to recite the masa'ib of Abu Abdullah, who used to recite poetry or did some association with the dhikr of Imam al-Hussain, that when they kept the mention of Imam al-Hussain alive, that Imam al-Hussain became the one who did shafa'ah. And Imam al-Hussain allows anyone who did shifa'ah, allows anyone who recited in the dhikr of the masa'ib to enter in through his shifa'ah. So the Sayyid, the teacher, he says, when I saw this in my dream, when I woke up, I thought about the affair. And I wanted and I had the desire that I should receive the shifa'ah of Imam al-Hussain. So I began the practice of reciting the masa'ib of Abu Abdullah, that he may include me in his shafa'ah. The same way our goal when we enter into these majalis, that somehow we become a part, we make an effort to be part of the dhikr and the azaa of Imam al-Hussain, that we may receive his shafa'ah. Because the difficulties of that day, we recite these masa'ib across 10 nights. Sometimes for 2 months we recite the masa'ib of Abu Abdullah. But don't forget, it wasn't that one day one person became shaheed, another day another person. No, all of these difficulties fell on Abu Abdullah in one day. Where Amir al-Mu'mineen would describe, he says, if our Shia heard the difficulty that will befall my Hussain on this land, their hair would turn white from the difficulties of Imam al-Hussain. Imam al-Baqir, who is one of the authentic narrators of Waqi' of Karbala, he says, if you knew what happened to my father, Aba Abdullah, you would die from the grief of how difficult that day was for Imam al-Hussain. The characteristics of Imam al-Hussain were such a loving personality that they described whenever Aba Abdullah would go somewhere, that there would be many children who would follow him everywhere that he went. When we talk about, for example, the love of Sayyidah Sakina with Aba Abdullah, this wasn't something that was only for Sayyidah Sakina. Aba Abdullah loved all of the children, where they were constantly in his company, going wherever he went. But the night of Ashura is a night when we read in history, we see that they only narrate that there was one young boy who was following Aba Abdullah wherever he went. And he kept saying, Ammu, will I have an opportunity tomorrow to be amongst the shuhada? That it was the son of Imam al-Hasan who followed on the heels of his uncle. Uncle, give me permission that tomorrow I will have a chance to be a shaheed as well. And eventually Aba Abdullah turned and said, Oh Qasim, tomorrow your name is written amongst the shuhada, and even your cousin Ali al-Askar is written amongst the shuhada. One narrator, he writes, he says, I imagine the ghurur and the pride of Qasim as he turned, and he says, Oh uncle, will the Mal'oon attack our tent? Is that how Ali al-Askar will become shaheed? Oh uncle, I can't stand that my mother and my aunts be attacked by the men. How dare they behave in this fashion? And Abu Abdullah says, no, Qasim, I will take Asghar myself to present his sacrifice. That night, Qasim secured permission to enter into the battlefield and to be amongst the warriors who were present. But the next day, when the morning came and the companions had been spent, we see Qasim again asking for permission as the Banu Hashim present their sacrifice. And now Abu Abdullah is saying, oh Qasim, your brothers presented their sacrifice. I don't want you to go into the battlefield. When we try and understand why Abu Abdullah would prevent this young boy of maybe 13 or 14 years from going into the battlefield, you have to look at tariq, you have to look at what was happening in the history of the event. One of the places of what we found out of what happened on the day of Ashura is that there was this personality, Mukhtar, who after Waqi' of Karbala collected all of the people from the army of Umar Sa'd and asked them one by one what it was that they did in the battlefield of Karbala. One such personality that Mukhtar caught was an archer from the army of Umar Sa'd. And he asked him, he says before he killed him, he asked him, what did you do in the field of Karbala? What atrocities did you commit? He says, I was the archer who killed Abdullah ibn Muslim ibn Aqil. The son of Muslim ibn Aqil, who was 18 years old and remained with Abu Abdullah, was one of the champions of Abu Abdullah and the champions of the Banu Hashim. When he entered into the battlefield in one-on-one combat, this Mal'oon narrates, it says in one-on-one combat, he killed over 90 of the soldiers of Umar Sa'd until we were ordered to shoot arrows at him. He says, I shot my first arrow at Abdullah ibn Muslim. When I shot my arrow, Abdullah ibn Muslim saw it coming, and he raised his hand to block the arrow. But my arrow was so strong, it pierced the hand of Abdullah and pinned his hand to his forehead. When this action happened, Abdullah turned and he cursed at me that, don't you know we are the children of Banu Hashim? You have no shame that you shoot arrows at us. As he spoke to me, oh Mukhtar, I raised my second arrow and I shot it through the chest of Abdullah ibn Muslim. When I shot it through the chest of Abdullah ibn Muslim, he fell to the ground dead. Now traditionally in a battle, what happens is each battalion, as they face off in the army, the battalion who is victorious receives a reward from the Khalifa. But in the case of Abu Abdullah, where there were only 70 warriors who fought with Imam al-Hussain, and over 5,000, some narrations say 30,000 soldiers in the army of Umar Sa'd, the army knew that the entire battalion would not be rewarded for killing one man. So whoever it was that killed a soldier of Imam al-Hussain would want his reward. So they would run into the battlefield after killing the soldier of Imam al-Hussain and cut his head from his body. So this Mal'oon narrates, he says, when Abdullah ibn Muslim fell, I ran into the battlefield and I wanted to collect his head. He says, first I removed my arrow from the chest of Abdullah. Then I came and I tried to remove the second arrow that had lodged in the forehead of Abdullah ibn Muslim. When I went to move the arrow, and he shows the action, the arrow was so stuck. I kept pulling the arrow from the head of this youth, from this child of the Banu Hashim. But the staff of the arrow would come out, but the head would not come out. The court of Mukhtar could take it no more. They said, you're evil before you, let us kill you. Mukhtar said, kill him the way he killed the son of Muslim. Kill him with your arrows. Now remember that this was the condition how the children of the Banu Hashim were being dealt with. When Qasim, a young boy of 13, comes before Abu Abdullah after the death of his cousin, and he says, Abu Abdullah, give me permission. Let me go and fight for you. And Abu Abdullah says, Qasim, I can't give you permission. Don't you see the evil intent with which they are fighting? There is nothing I can do to protect you if you go. Eventually Qasim receives permission when he bids his final farewell to his uncle. Remember, Qasim was maybe 2, 3, 4 years of age when his father passed away. For 10 years, Qasim was raised by the hands of Abu Abdullah. Abu Abdullah, who loved children, loved his nephew. They describe the separation of Qasim from Abu Abdullah. They said that when they hugged each other, the two from their thirst, from the heat, wept so much that they eventually passed out in front of the tents for a moment. When they came to, Abu Abdullah gave Qasim permission. There is some unique status of this Qasim, why we mention his shahada. One of these unique status is that in the field of Karbala, Qasim is one of the only soldiers of Abu Abdullah for whom they describe what he wore into the battlefield. They say that Qasim was a child who came wearing the ammama of his father, Imam al-Hassan. He wore a cloak over his shoulders, a shirt, and a pair of sandals. It may find something odd. Why would they describe what Qasim wears into the battle? They describe because Qasim was such a small child that he did not have any armor to wear when he went to fight. He was a small child for whom the chainmail would not fit him. That when he went into battle, he did not go dressed as a soldier. He went dressed as a child. The second description that they give of Qasim that is unique is that many of the soldiers would walk into battle reciting the rijz, that they would recite their characteristics of who they are. Others would ride their horses and stand before the army. But this Qasim they describe was a child of 13 years who, when he saw the army before him and finally he received permission, Qasim did not ride into battle and he did not walk into the battlefield. They said this young boy held a sword in his hand and ran and charged at the army of Umar Isad, saying, if you don't know me, then I am the son of Al-Hassan. I am the son of Al-Hassan Al-Qasim, who comes to defend my uncle. And this child had no sense to know that how it is that he approaches death, that he runs to death. But still they say this child is the child of Imam Al-Hassan. So he fought with great bravery. All of the children of Banu Hashim, they received their training from their uncle Abbas. And this Qasim was none less than them, and he fought with great bravery. But when he entered the battlefield, the enemy looked at him and they said, this is a child. They said he was mithl shaq al-qamar, that he was like a piece of the moon when they looked at him and how beautiful and innocent he was as a child. They said, who is it that would be so forlorn that they send such a beautiful child into the battlefield? So one of the champions of Umar Isad says, send my sons to fight him. One by one he sent his sons, and Qasim in his bravery killed all of them, until finally this father who became frustrated with this child, and he entered into the battlefield as a grown, mature warrior fighting a 14-year-old boy. One of my teachers narrates, he says, imagine the difficulty that you are Al-Abbas standing in the back. You are seeing the child you trained with your own hands, who is thirsty for 3 days, fighting against enemies who are thirsty for his blood and who are fresh. And imagine that now a seasoned warrior comes before this child. He says, I imagine that uncle who cried out, have you no shame? Have you no mercy? You are a grown warrior. My child, my nephew is thirsty for 3 days. He is a boy of 13 with no armor and you come to fight him. They said Al-Qasim killed over 35 of the enemies of enemies from the army of Umar Asad, until eventually at one point in time when they talk about the innocence of this child, they say that this child, as he was fighting, the strap of his sandal became broken. And as he finished his last fight, he stood there and he had such ghairat, he had such pride in himself that he said, I do not like to stand here with even a broken sandal. And he put down his sword and bent to fix his sandal. Amr al-Azdi mal'oon said, I will make his mother weep upon him. They said, but this is such a small child. He says, let me be the one who collects the reward from the murder of this child. They say, as Qasim kneeled on the field of Karbala, not caring that an army thirsty for his blood stands before him, he kneeled to fix his sandal, and the mal'oon struck the head of Al-Qasim. Amr al-Azdi, when he strikes, this small child calls out, uncle, come to my aid, I have fallen, they have struck me. I imagine it is as much surprise that Qasim is surprised. I did not even raise my sword upon you and you killed me. They describe that Aba Abdullah came to the field in the aid of Qasim like an eagle comes after its prey, like a lion who charges after its prey. And they say that when Aba Abdullah entered the battlefield, he found Amr al-Azdi sitting over the body of Qasim, lying in the field of Karbala, ready with his sword on the throat of Qasim. When Abu Abdullah saw this, he said, you mal'oon, you murder our children before our eyes, you have no shame. Abu Abdullah struck at Amr al-Azdi, cut the hand of Amr al-Azdi. Amr al-Azdi screamed in the battlefield. The army of Umar Asad came to the assistance of Amr al-Azdi. When they wanted to separate Abu Abdullah, the horses, they ran through the battlefield to move Abu Abdullah away from Qasim. In the process, they trampled the body of Al-Qasim. Abu Makhnaf writes, he says, Qasim is the one who, when he called his uncle, he was alive. But when his uncle reached him, Qasim had died. We believe that maybe Qasim was the one who was trampled in his life and murdered in this way. They say Abu Abdullah came to his nephew and recited poetry. How unfortunate is the uncle who can't come to the aid of his nephew. How sad am I, my nephew called to me and there was nothing I could do to help him. They say Abu Abdullah laid his own Abba on the ground and laid Qasim upon the Abba and closed the Abba. The next description in history says Abu Abdullah held the body of Qasim to his chest and walked back to the camp. They say as he walked back, the feet of Qasim would drag on the ground. One mu'arrikh says, why would the child who is hugged to the chest of a grown man, his feet drag on the ground? One said that maybe the back of Abu Abdullah had become hunched by the loss of Al-Qasim. Another mu'arrikh writes, he says, the body of Qasim had been trampled so badly that his insides had stretched out, that his back and his body were no longer connected. So when the grown man Abu Abdullah holds the chest of the child to him, the body now is stretched and the feet rub on the ground as he takes back. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Ala la'natullahi ala al-qawm al-zalimin. Wa saya'lamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalibin yanqalibun. Rahimallahu man yaqra suratul Fatiha ma'a as-salawat.
तमाम मोमिन और मोमिनात से इल्तिमास है जो भी मेहंदी के लिए हज़रत कासिम की मेहंदी के लिए जो भी तबरुकात लेकर आए वो मर्दानी साइड पे मेन साइड पे डाइनिंग हॉल में ला के रख दें प्लीज़। बर मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि मोहम्मद अल्लाहुम्मा
शबीर ने झूले वाले की तुरबा जो बनाई करबल में, आकाश के दिल को चीर गई, धरती की दुहाई करबल में। वो देश नहीं परदेस सही, मादर ने मगर सोचा भी न था, होगी मेरे नन्हे बच्चों की यूं दूध बढ़ाई करबल में। शबीर का नन्हा शहजादा उम्मत को जगा कर सोया था, सुनते हैं तड़पते जर्रों को, फिर नींद न आई करबल में। तन्हा था नबी का लाल मगर, जब दिल की निगाहों से देखा, लिपटी हुई उसके कदमों से दुनिया नजर आई करबल में। उठती रही लहरें दरिया की, प्यासी ही रही औलाद नबी। उठती रही लहरें